All right, welcome back to Return on Podcast, where we talk about the experiences, obsessions, and habits of the most successful e-commerce entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Tyler Jeffcoat, and whether you're listening to this episode on one of the podcast players like Apple or Spotify, or I think like 3 of you listen to it through the website. No one listens to podcasts through the website, but it's on the Seller Accountant website, or whether you're watching this on the YouTube channel. I just want to thank you for spending your time with me today. So I can't wait to talk to my guest today, but I want to tee him up before I bring on this interview. Samir Shergill is the co-founder and CEO of a tech startup, highbeam.co. Highbeam.co is one of these banks that has tried to take technology, has tried to take a better way to kind of get away from the stodgy old banks and help our e-commerce brands do better. I thought this discussion with Samir was fascinating because of his level of insight into how the capital markets are evolving right now, how banking as an institution is kind of evolving to make it easier for small businesses to work with. Samir is really, really knowledgeable when it comes to managing cash flow and how to use some of the analytics. I was really impressed with his accessibility. I mean, I worked for a gigantic bank for 5 years prior to starting my first company, and I can't tell you how not like a standard CEO of a huge bank Samir is. This guy was a real stud. I really enjoyed getting to visit with him and talk to him. And I just want to paint this picture, right? Why is cash flow so hard for your business right now? And here's why. You can make money on paper. You can generate a profit as an e-commerce brand and have a bad cash cycle, which is kind of a normal cash cycle in this industry, where you have to place the purchase, pay the PO, satisfy the supplier before the product arrives, whether it's in your warehouse or a 3PL or an FBA. And that distance, that amount of time between when you have to pay your money and when you actually get that cash back creates a problem. And it only creates a meaningful problem when you're growing. And so for brands that Seller Accountant helped that were growing a lot, let's say like back in 2022, those guys came to me at the end of the year and were like, Tyler, your bookkeeping team sent me books and I made a profit. In fact, the IRS is hounding me to pay my taxes based on this profit. And yet I don't have any money. Where did all the cash go? And when you took a closer look at those brands, they had 2 things in common. One is that their inventory had ballooned. It had bloated disproportionately. But if their sales doubled, their inventory more than doubled, like that kind of thing. That was the first phenomenon. And then the second phenomenon was they had really bad debt. They had picked up the wrong kind of lending partners to help them satisfy the growing needs of their business. And so I'm hoping that this conversation with Samir today may give you some insights on how to address both sides of that. Hey, how to get better at negotiating your supply chain and how to be mindful of what's out there right now in the lending world so that you're not falling prey to these predatory lenders that are around. So enjoy today's episode with Samir from Highbeam.co. It's time to maximize profitability and cash flow. It's time to learn habits and hacks from the best e-com CEOs. It's time for Return on Podcast with me, Tyler Jeffcoat. All right, today I get to welcome Samir Shergill to the show. Samir, I'm looking at you, buddy, but you're the co-founder, the CEO of a tech startup / bank. I don't know if you guys realize, but fintech is actually mashing those 2 concepts together. Highbeam.co. It's a banking platform that helps brand founders and operators grow sustainable businesses through smart financial decisions, which is like music to my ears. And I have to confess here, Samir, I am also a recovering banker. So, we always say don't hold it against me, but once a banker, always a banker in some sense. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I will also fess up to being a recovering large company finance technology person that's now trying to maybe switch over from the dark side to maybe doing something positive on this side. But no, jokes aside, it's great to chat and looking forward to this.
Love it, love it, love it. So a little, under the hood here for those of you guys listening to the episode here today. Samir and I tried this 3 days ago. We had some major internet snafus. It could have been either side, but we're trying again. And Samir, so I want to pick up our conversation. I just want to hear a little bit about how a guy goes undergrad, grad school, recovering computer engineering, working for big dogs like Microsoft, and then all of a sudden you're raising venture capital and building your own banking platform. How in the world did that pivot happen?
Yeah, no, happy to chat about it. So, started off software engineering at Microsoft, which was great. I feel like Microsoft had quite the resurgence now, but this is back in the early 2000s when, they had Office and Windows and we're going to rule the world forevermore. This is like generative AI was still, no one even had the buzzword yet. So it's a long time ago, but I had a great time there. But I realized that, software engineering long term wasn't something that I was super passionate about. So ended up going to business school, which in retrospect isn't necessarily a place to find what you're passionate about. It's more a place to just go and kind of like figure out what's your, have a good 2 year break. But I think the formative experience for me was, I joined a company called AppNexus, which was an ad tech startup in New York. And was fortunate enough that it was a time when e-commerce was kind of gaining steam and this kind of movement of people starting businesses to sell stuff directly and this kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem evolved that was super exciting. And we were trying to help them with the advertising side of things in terms of how do you advertise effectively on Facebook or Instagram, all these new platforms. But one thing that kept coming back to me was, a lot of these brand founders, they were so passionate about the business and the product they were selling, and they were really, really interested in how they made that happen. What they didn't always realize was that a key component for this type of business was, can you effectively manage your cash flow and finances because of the nature of the cash cycle and the capital intensive nature. But this was combined with the problem that a lot of times, until you grow large enough, you can't afford to have a full-time CFO or a full-time finance person. So if you didn't have the finance background, it's like, how do I even solve for this? And what personally frustrated me was that I felt like there was a lot of, I'll call them even predatory products that kind of crept in to try to kind of take advantage of this. And it was kind of personally for me a way to start a business that I felt could really help, one, with a real problem, but two, get to deal with customers that I truly enjoy dealing with. Like I joke about this all the time. Like one of the most underrated things about starting a business is, do you really love your customers? And I've been fortunate that people that are our customers are building these brands and businesses, and they're personally invested in the success of the company. And so that's kind of how a long about answer on how I ended up starting Highbeam and how we're fortunate to deal with kind of brand founders and owners and help them with their finances today.
I love that story, and it resonates so much with me. I remember really it being the same for us when we started Seller Accountant, where it's like, you know what, at every business, if it's going to be successful, and you guys know this, even as brand builders out there, you have to have a hero of your story that's not yourself, right? Like if the hero of your story is, I want to make an extra $1,000, you're going to run out of gas pretty quickly, because starting a company is hard. Sometimes it really sucks. You guys all know that. You guys have been through it. It's what do you lean back on when you're in the fetal position at 2:30 in the morning, hoping that something comes through for you that you're not sure, right? And I think having a genuine, honestly, there's no way to fake it. Having a genuine heart to help your customers really thrive is kind of the best antidote. Hey, you talk about cash flow. This is what I want to dig into. So, also near and dear to my heart. Also, really was disappointed through the kind of heat of the pandemic at how many predatory options arose.
Right.
And the reason these predatory options, I think, came out of nowhere, Samir, was we bought a lot of inventory and we didn't know how to manage cash, right? And so as a result, we needed cash relief and we needed it quickly. And I guess, let me just ask you this broad question. You take it wherever you want to take it, but how does cash flow really drive business health?
It's a great question. And I think for brands in particular, it's so critical compared to some businesses. And I'll kind of hopefully lay out why. As a brand owner or operator, you're spending on sales. You're trying to drive sales, but you're spending on marketing and supplies and inventory ahead of those sales. So that means you have to push cash out the door before it comes in. So what this means is you constantly have to manage. Now, imagine this in a steady state scenario where you're spending $1,000 and then 2 weeks later you get $1,500. Okay, that's great. It kind of works. Now inject kind of a high growth environment where the pandemic started. And now suddenly you're seeing, wait, my sales doubled. Well, that's great news, but that means now you have to put $2,000 out the door to get $2,500 or $3,000 2 months from now. So that means even though your business has grown, you have to push more cash into the business. And that's kind of counterintuitive. So a lot of businesses started realizing, wait a minute, my business doubled, but instead of getting cash out of the business, I got to push more cash into the business. Well, how does this work? And this is something where, unless you manage it really closely, you can grow yourself into bankruptcy. Like, we have businesses that we worked with that on a P&L basis, a gross margin basis, you're like, this business looks great. But because you have to spend ahead of the sales, you could grow too quickly and run out of cash and go bankrupt, which is really strange for someone who hasn't thought about the finances. And so part of what we're trying to do, and what this really with the cash flow cycle management is, one, you got to understand the drivers of cash in your business and how you can control and manage those effectively. And what we find is the financial tools and what you need to do that, unless you're kind of an accountant like you, or like have a background in finance, it can be hard with the generic tools to really get a handle on that. And so part of what we're trying to do is a little bit of the literacy around that, but a little bit also about people recognizing how important that is, to having a sustainable business. Like, in some ways, I mean this somewhat facetiously, like, we're all tied up with our top line numbers, right? Like, you talk to somebody, you're like, oh, we're a 7-figure brand, we're an 8-figure brand, we're a 9-figure brand. That's aspirational, right? For the tech founders, the equivalent is like valuation. People talk about, oh, I raised at this number. Now, that's really, it's somewhat meaningful. It's a milestone to celebrate, but it's meaningless unless it results in cash and profits on the other side. And so a large part of this is, how do you drive the kind of discipline, the tooling to make sure that occurs? And that's kind of where we're trying to put more emphasis and focus on.
And so for the brand owners that might listen to this or watch this on YouTube, Samir, because they're feeling that all of us ended up with a lot of inventory, and then the interest rates triple, and next thing you know, you have this phenomenon of, wait a second, didn't I just make a profit, and why am I out of money, right? Like that kind of phenomenon.
That's right.
Like, maybe to get a little bit, kind of dig into the tactical side of it. Like, what do you have any counsel or advice for how a brand owner that finds himself or herself in that position, like, what do you do about that? Like, how is it, what are some tactics, or what are some things that have helped your customers manage cash better so they don't have to feel that panic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's hard for even people with full-time finance teams to get their handle on this and do it effectively. So it's something that, I think sometimes people try to stick their head in the sand a bit and, like, say, like, they kind of manage it from crisis to crisis and say, like, oh no, I need a supplier payment tomorrow, I'm just going to grab this cash from here and hope for the best. And I understand that instinct, but the couple of pieces of advice we give are, like, first, do an assessment and build a view of where your cash has gone over the last year, and split into 2 buckets: the operating flows and the financing flows. By that I mean, the operating flows are the flows of money that you've used to run your business. You've paid suppliers, you've paid marketing, you've done things to actually manage the business. The financing flows are money flows that have gone towards interest or loans or investment or things that aren't about running the business. And usually, and we help brands with this, even the first assessment of looking at that, people's eyes open, like, wow, I can't believe that I've spent this much money on my financing flows, money in and out. And sometimes that swamps the operating flows. So they're like, okay, now we have a source of truth to look at. Let's just build a basic forecast for the next 3 months. And I think this is where people start thinking, well, how do I do this? What do I think of? I'm like, look, for most brands, there's only 2 levers: how much you're going to spend on supplies, how much you're going to spend on marketing. Let's just put some basic forecasting and see where you're at. And then at this point, most people start getting at least a sense of confidence, like, I have something to work with. And then you can kind of work from there. But I'd say, like, step 1, try to build this basic cash flow. And we have some tips and tools on how to do this. You don't have to work with Hybeam. You can do this, on your own. And 2, then build a basic forecast so you get some confidence, you can get ahead of the problem. I think the most painful parts come when you feel like you don't know and you feel helpless. And then you start doing, like, oh, let me get this easy cash from here. And the problem with the easy cash from here is a lot of times that comes with, rates that aren't sustainable for the business.
Yeah, and you, a few minutes ago, you're like, yeah, if you're not an accountant like Tyler, but I just want to, like, confess this. I finished grad school also for business and started a healthcare company in 2012. And Samir, I almost crashed that business monthly. Like, we went from 0 to 100 employees in 2.5 years.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
our ability to manage the balance sheet, meaning did we have a business that was getting fundamentally healthier was awful. Like, and I have to point the finger at myself, right? And so a guy who, whatever, from an education standpoint, should have been really good at this, was
Sure.
incredibly bad at it. And it's funny, you're talking about like an MBA program maybe not being the best place to figure out what you're passionate about. It's also not a great place to learn how to overcome like actual crisis and cash when you're like trying to build a new company. And so I think just for anyone out there who does feel that level of stress, here's what I have found. And by the way, I was telling somebody this yesterday, maybe you found this also, Samir, but I've learned more about managing cash this year than I
Yes.
maybe have in my entire career because, and you and I are, I think, similar in age, but like I've never been a CEO in a bear market prior to
That's right.
2022. Like if you think about it, like we've been in this like just complete upswing, 2 months of downswing for the pandemic. But for the most part, the last 15 years have been really relatively straightforward. Pedal to the metal has kind of been the one strategy. And now I think for me, and this is just literally, I'm saying this, you and I are recording this on a Friday afternoon. Yesterday, I literally had a budget meeting with my team internally at Seller Accountant to be like, oh, okay, we're falling short a little bit next month according versus our budget. Great, we can make an adjustment here proactively to make sure that we're in good shape financially. In other words, like even we had to adopt, and I'm a freaking accounting firm, right? We do cash flow forecast for our clients, and it still
Yes.
requires an entrepreneurial discipline to not ignore the numbers. Because I'll say this is what I have some close friends that did go through some bankruptcies, and it was really tempting to like kind of ignore the hard potential truth because you don't really
Yes.
want to look at it.
Yes.
And so anyway, the thing you said is just so powerful. Like you've got to have a tool in place that allows you to regularly look at the truth, because even if the truth isn't great, it immediately lowers your anxiety when you know what the real problem is and you can make adjustments.
And you shifted from this sense of uncertainty to action. So I think the biggest shift we see with our clients is when they're concerned. It's like, and you probably felt this, and I feel this all the time. Like the biggest, when you feel like you're not in control, that's the worst feeling. And you feel like you don't know what you have to do. Like if there's something hard you have to do, you have to go fire someone. You have to go cut your costs. You have to go do it. At least you know what you have to do and why and how to get there.
Right.
It's the feeling of uncertainty and just like that's for me at least personally, that's the most kind of the hardest part of it. So that's like trying to get out of that. I think you mentioned something there which is really interesting, is that this is for a lot of us the first time we're out in a bear market, or at least some degree of that. And I think that the macro trends of rising interest rates kind of coincided with a softening of demand for a lot of brands, and they've written these like tailwinds through the pandemic, and people were like, when things are good, it washes away a lot of, I'd say, like indiscipline or whatever you want to call it, because you're like, look, sales are going to grow up anyway. It doesn't matter. I can afford to overhire. I can afford to have more inventory. It'll take care of itself. But now there's this flattening out. And I think the advice we give is like, that's okay in some ways. Like you have to drive discipline for the long term and take this opportunity to restructure. So a lot of the times we have this kind of, I talk to brands, I think you can't solve operational problems with financial solutions. So
Yep.
if the reality is that your sales have slowed and that your fixed costs are not going to match up with that, like don't lie to yourself and think that, or maybe it will fix itself in 6 months, but you can't solve that through a short-term loan. Maybe you can get the cash flow over the hump, but the real problem and solution is that you have to lower your fixed costs. So that might mean the tough decision of letting someone go or doing something else, but make that decision now. Don't kick that can down the road, take a high interest loan, and 4 months later be in the same position. And that's the part where it's hard to do. But once you do it, there's this feeling of like, okay, I've retrenched, I've gotten it, I'm going again. And that's the part that's most rewarding for me personally is, then you feel like you're really being a partner and then we're building a plan together. And that's really, what the hope is and the kind of pushing through this period.
Yeah, and for those of us out there that have kind of like follow tech news or maybe like watch Shark Tank or something like that, I think you made a really good point there, Samir, that we can like believe that the entire game is to build enough hope that then we can like somehow go raise money at a great valuation and hey, we get rich and everyone's happy. But I think that comment you made, just to rephrase it in my own words here, is adding cash to a situation only magnifies or amplifies that situation.
Yes.
In other words, if
Yes.
you have a
Love
machine
that.
that is
Yes.
that is generating profitable value for your customers, fueling that machine with additional capital is going to make you better. But we've seen, I know you have with your companies that you serve also, if the fundamental engine of growth or engine of profit for your business is flawed, then doubling down and just adding another $500,000 in capital is not, believe it or not, that doesn't make your problems better. It actually makes them worse because you end up
Correct.
spiraling and accumulating more interest debt and interest rates and expenses and that kind of thing. So, gosh, that's so important. So, I mean, anything else related to anything else that you're seeing that's like, wow, this is really important in terms of managing cash flow?
Right. I think the thing with the higher interest rates now is that it comes with advantages and disadvantages. So, most people, they have no reason to think about the Fed fund rate or things of this nature. The reality is
Right.
that macro trends might impact you slowly, but they're inexorable. And so what we've done in the last year has been somewhat unprecedented, which is the Federal Reserve and the government has raised rates from close to 0 to 5.5%. So what does this mean for you as a brand owner? It means a few things: that the government is trying to really put the brakes on the economy and slow inflation down. And what they're doing is they're dampening demand in the long run. And this is like a sledgehammer. It's not like, it impacts everyone the same way, but over time it will work. What does this mean for you as a company is that a few things. One, cash and debt is getting more expensive. So where that first loan a year ago might have been expensive, but you didn't really have to care about it, now you have to take a really close look on, can I afford this? Because everything is more expensive. The
Yep.
second is most brands are running very heavy cash flow businesses. Like money comes in, money goes out, right? And that's the nature of the beast, and that's the nature of the cash flow cycle. Before, you couldn't make any money on that cash really because interest rates were at 0%. Now you actually have an opportunity that didn't exist to get yield out of that cash when you do have it. So if you can optimize your cash cycle, and even when you have yield for like the 2 weeks before you pay your supplier, or you had a good Tuesday from Shopify, or you had a good month that you didn't expect, there is an opportunity to earn tens of thousands of dollars on that yield if you can set it up the right way. And a lot of times when we work with brands, for example, is, we'll ask brands like, well, how much do you make in your operating checking account? And they're like, 0. And you're like, okay, so how do you move money to your high yield account? They're like, what high yield account? And you're like, okay. They're like, but we don't have excess cash. I'm like, it doesn't matter. You still have this cash cycle. And part of what I kind of fault a bit of the finance industry for this is like, your bank is making 5% on the cash that you've kept with them. They might choose not to give you any of that, but that's what the Fed rate is set to now. So you do have to consider and take a hard look, I think, at both your interest in terms of your loans that you're taking, and are you getting yield on your cash? And these are two things that a year ago you probably didn't need to think about, but now it's probably meaningful enough that it's worth it for profitability to take a hard look at.
That's such an amazing point where um, we're a little pissed off. We're onery right now, Samir, because the cost of capital for us to get a loan has tripled in the last year.
Right.
But let's not forget that if we do have some cash, so maybe we've been a little bit more conservative, we've burned through some extra inventory. Shame on us if we leave that money in a zero interest yielding,
Correct.
even operating account. So tell us, I mean, this podcast is not a commercial for Highbeam, but I'm a huge fan of what you guys are doing. Would you tell us about how like you're seeing those operating accounts and high yield accounts kind of evolve and kind of, I feel like it's some ways you guys are kind of molding those two concepts together. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and because we only deal with brands, we've tried to make our financial products that really apply to what a brand would use. And so, as I mentioned, brands are flow businesses. And the second thing is like it's really hard to manage this day to day. Like you have money coming in every day, going out every day. It's almost impossible to forecast a week from now, am I going to have excess cash or not? And am I going to move it to a separate account? So rather than the usual, what we've set up is you can get not only up to 3% yield in your operating account, we have a 4.5% high yield account, and we'll daily auto sweep for you and maintain a balance between the two. So what that means is if you say, look, for my business, I want to maintain a $100,000 buffer for my operating account, but automatically move stuff back and forth every day so that I maximize my yield. It's like having kind of an in-house treasury team. So through software, we're trying to say, look, can we give you just push a button and get some automated yield on my cash for as long as I have it? And people think like, well, how much can that really impact? And sure, it depends. But for me, that's like indicative of like there's few thousands of dollars that are just there in that cycle that you want to make sure you take. And it's just kind of somewhat of an aside, but it's interesting aside is like, if you think of your payroll provider, like people use like an ADP or a Gusto or whoever it is, so they take your money out maybe 3 days before they pay someone, right? And so they take it out 3 days before they pay. And you think that makes sense. Okay, that's fine. In a high interest rate environment, a large chunk of their profits come from just being able to keep that extra float for those 3 days. And that's an example of a lever that they've pulled that for them has caused their profits to go up 30%, that they didn't have that lever before. And so even in your business, you have these levers that if you maximize your cash cycle, you can find kind of this free money that's in there. And that's a large part of the part that we try to work with them to do is like, let's identify that and then let's set it up to make it happen.
No, it makes so much sense. And it does seem like it's like small ball until you actually think about it. Part of our kind of cycle as a CFO firm and as a bookkeeping firm is we'll say, hey, let's take a peek at some of those operating SG&A kind of expenses. Let's look at your software. You're paying for 19 variations of the same Amazon tool. Can we pick 2 or 3? And so we'll take a few minutes to save what may only be $20 a month, but hey, that's $240 a year. That's pretty meaningful. If you think about this, if you're operating with a net working capital of $100,000 or $200,000, what Samir just said is like you just found $3,000 to $5,000 a year in actual additional profit for your business. And as the net working capital needed in your company continues to grow, it'll obviously be more than that. So I think it's interesting. We always try to prioritize our efforts based on impact, right? So you're never gonna make as much money for yourself finding a way to be in the highest yield interest account if you can go renegotiate your supply chain because you're paying 30% of your entire budget to your cost of goods sold. But having said that, if you can find something that takes you zero effort, like for instance, just having an account that automatically pays you interest, then that is an extremely high return on investment activity, is to make sure you have account partners that give you favorable rates and are not just taking advantage of you. So I think it's a pretty powerful tool. If you guys have not checked out HighBeam, I'm a fan. What else do you have to say about that, Samir?
No, Tyler, I really appreciate that. And actually, one thing you said there just got my wheels turning a bit was like, I love the idea of like, stack ranking and prioritizing the impact on your business. And then kind of, we're also busy, right? We got to go and like knock out the things that have the most impact on us. One thing that I keep telling brand owners, like, don't think about the stack order priority of the impact of your sales. Think of it on the profits and cash flow. That's the mindset shift you need. Because what I mentioned right now has zero impact on your sales. No impact. Right. So people were always used to like, they'll think about marketing all the time. It's essential because that's their sales. And they think about like fulfillment and product and like that product cycle of sales. Stack rank stuff according to your profitability and cash flow, or at least be aware of that, because that list might be slightly different. So if you think about the things like, we'll tell people like for most brands, most of your money out, 95% of it's to 25 vendors. Like it's your suppliers, your fulfillment, your marketing, there's like 20 vendors. And so look at those 20 vendors month over month over month, see how much you're spending on them, take the top 5, see if you can either renegotiate or pay them later or whatever it is. These are things that are not fun. No one wants to do them, right? They're like, I'll always find a reason to put it off. But if you think of the impact of that on your profits, you kind of owe it to your business to go do it. And so I'd say like that's one piece we tell people, like just think through the top 4 or 5 things that are stack ranked important to your profits and your cash flow, not your sales. And then you'll force yourself to go do it. Otherwise, there's always a reason not to. And that's kind of, I think, the mindset shift from last year.
And Samir, I've found myself kind of gamifying that a little bit. So I'm a big fan of like, James Clear's work and habits and how do you create processes and repeatable rhythms that generate value. And so here's what I recommend you guys doing if you want to take Samir's advice. The game is to have 1 hour a month on your calendar. Like just put it in Google Calendar or whatever calendar system you use and make it an automatic one for the first Tuesday or whatever day you want. And force yourself to see how much of either dollars less that you can spend per month, or how many additional days of relief you can get before you have to pay a bill. You can do
Yes.
1 hour a month. I'm saying if you literally did this for 60 minutes a month and sent 4 emails or made a phone call to your supplier and said, hey Tyler, I can keep paying you these rates. I love our partnership. I need another week of cash cycle before I can make my payments. How would you feel about that? You're not going to hit a home run every time you make those phone calls, but our clients have consistently seen meaningful impact. And to the point, I mean, guys, the reason these businesses are hard is what Samir said at the very beginning of this interview, which is we have to have money and invest it 3, 4, 5 months before we get the return. If you can shorten that 3, 4, 5 months, even by a month, the amount of net working capital needed in your business will be much more efficient and game
I
changer.
love that. I love it, Tyler. And if I could just add one thing to that, I mentioned
Yes.
before the distinction between operating flows and financial flows. There's the same thing in your business on operating partners and financial partners. Your operating partners are your suppliers, the marketers, the people that are helping you run your business. They will always be cheaper and better partners to you for the most part than your financial partners. Your financial partners have only one interest in the long run, and that's the financial relationship. So if you always get, so for in your example, telling a supplier that can I pay you 2 weeks later, it's almost always going to be financially a better way to get that cash advantage than trying to go to your financial partner and saying like, hey, give me a better rate on my interest or whatever it is. And that's such an underused lever. And I love that idea of setting 1 hour. And like there's best practices around like, you know, we do this for a lot of our clients. Like, set up your payments in advance, but set it at the last possible minute. So set up schedule. Don't, even if you have the cash right now, set up if you don't owe it today, set up the scheduled payment 2 weeks from now and set it up for same day ACH so that it hits that day. But don't do it in advance. Keep that cash as long as you can for yourself, because that's going to really improve your business right now, and do the things to make sure that occurs.
I love it. I think it's so great. So I want to have some fun here before we end the interview here, Samir. But I just want to say this again. Highbeam.co
.co.
.co, yeah, .co, highbeam.co is really a technology platform that makes getting the right lending and also having higher yield interest-bearing accounts. I love the dashboard and analytics. So we use a lot of sophisticated tools to help our clients model things. You might be using a Google Sheet or a spreadsheet. I think Highbeam could be a solution that, hey, I'm having to integrate my bank account with QuickBooks and then integrate QuickBooks with Fathom and then build a customer report within Fathom so I can get visibility. What if my banking dashboard gave me better visibility? Highbeam might be a good partner to explore there. Anything else you want to say about Highbeam? And then I want to ask you a kind of personal question here.
No. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to offer up like my personal email address is Samir, SAMIR at highbeam.co if you're a listener and I can be helpful, both from a standpoint of, obviously from Highbeam's perspective, but even if there's best practices or things that we can be helpful with. I love talking to brand owners. And so please drop me a line directly as well, and always happy to chat.
Love it. That's amazing. So, okay. So before we started recording, you and I were laughing because we both wrangle kids for a second living, like we own businesses, and then there's like a family thing. When you're not, wiping butts or chasing babies, what do you do for fun? What is it that gives you life if you have like disposable time, or do you have any of that?
I'm sure you feel the same way. Like my definition of disposable time before kids and before running a business is completely different from afterwards. I think that I was always a huge soccer fan. I try to make it out to, my sister lives in England, and so I try to make it out to watch a game every once in a while there. I follow Arsenal pretty closely, but outside of sports, and we don't travel as much as we used to. That's kind of like, I do find, and this is a little related to your question, is I try to create. It sounds so funny. Like I used to think about scheduling of time as something that was imposing the structure that was the opposite of freedom, right? And so I would never, disposable time to me was like I have nothing to do. I'm just like an evening to myself. And now it's the opposite. I like actually micro schedule every little piece, and it's the only way I can end up with disposable time. So if you look at my calendar, it's like literally like 30-minute chunks of like, do this, do this, do this. And so when I do have those like, micro chunks, a lot of times it's trying to spend time with kids and travel and some amount of sports, but nothing too specific. But that's about kind of what I end up doing.
I love that. Yeah, it is. As you get full, as life gets more full, my mentor always said, busy is a choice, but having a full life is a good thing. And so like when you have a full life like you do, being making the choice to make time to do things that are important, I think is crucial. So I
I
applaud
think,
you for doing that.
and I wonder if you feel this way because I was talking to someone else who started a business while, they had kids and young kids in my case, and it was like, well, isn't that so hard to do? And it's interesting. I feel like before I had kids, because there wasn't a backstop. Like now, I want to get back home for their bedtime. I want to be there for them doing certain things. Before, I would just like work harder and just stay longer. And while that's needed sometimes, I was much less efficient than I feel like I am now, where I can like box something up for. And I got this real good piece of advice that was like, don't calendar for the outcome, calendar for the effort. So, it's hard to calendar for, I'm going to finish this in 30 minutes. Maybe you will or maybe you won't. But if you can calendar for, I'm going to work on this for 30 minutes, you'll be surprised how much you get done. And that's kind of what I do now. It's like I calendar for the effort. And so it's like that, doing that, and usually it ends up being much more effective than saying like, oh, I'm just going to do it till it's done. Because then you can always find a reason not to do it. And kind of,
Right.
I feel like getting that 90% of the work done as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible, that's helped me. And then in some ways, strangely enough, having less time is somewhat helpful to get sure that you get stuff done, because there's always a list of 100 things to get done. So I've also learned that if it's not on the calendar, it's not getting done. So that's kind of
Yep.
I used to like have meetings 9 to 9, and you're like, wait, that's useful,
Yes.
but it's not really getting anything done. So that's the other kind of, one trick that I've kind of learned recently.
I love that. I think that's so good. Is it maybe Parkinson's law that, the demand for a resource will always stretch to its supply,
Yes.
right? So if you give yourself an open-ended, I will take as long as it takes to do this project, guess what? You're going to take all day to do it. And if you say, I'm going to set, and I literally do this, I like one of my favorite features of the Apple Watch is just hitting a little timer. And
There you
for me, it's
go. I
like,
use the same words.
do my effing job block. I'll have like that's on my calendar, like all the stuff I don't want to do this week. It's all the like to do stuff. Maybe my assistant's put on my week, and I'm like, I don't want to make that email. I don't want to do this. All right, I'm going to set a 30, like I gamify it. Like I'm going to set like a 33-minute timer, and like my ass is doing nothing until I get that 33 minutes done. And it
Love
is,
it.
like you said, it's amazing how much you can crush with a small focused window to get it done. And for those of us who are entrepreneurs, we also tend to be the kind of people that can procrastinate for sport if we're not careful. I know that I'm one of
Yes.
those, and so creating those boundaries can definitely make us more effective. Um,
Totally
so any
agree.
other
And
hacks? That
it's
was like, go ahead, man. I'm sorry. Finish your comment.
no, please, please, please.
I was just gonna say, like, that's a really good like life productivity hack. How do I protect more energy to be with my kids or to travel? Well, it's to use kind of an intelligent calendaring. Use calendaring as a verb. I love that. Like calendar on purpose so that you can get the most done. I'm just curious, did any other habits or hacks pop into your mind? You're like, this is something that if I could give a listener the gift of building this rhythm into their life or into their work habits or into their personal habits to give them maximum ROI, I would say, guys, you got to try this out. Did anything pop into your mind?
So it's a little bit maybe for people. You mentioned we're the same age, so I'm in my 40s now, and I think that for me, what I've learned is being aware and managing my energy is almost the most important thing I can do. And so
Yep.
I think early on, I took it for granted that I'm just going to grind. And I had this mindset of like, it doesn't matter how tired I am. I'm just going to keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. And I find like now I'm much more aware of the times and efforts and what I need to do to manage my energy. So for example, maybe I'll go choose to, I would never, for example, choosing to go for a run or work out in the morning at the cost of doing some work. But now I feel like, look, that actually is going to help me manage my energy so that I feel that sense of like purpose and drive and feel healthy. And so I feel like being aware of my energy from the morning to the evening and then scheduling things where I know I'll have the most energy. So if I feel like in the morning is the time where I'm going to have the most energy for customers or effort or whatever it is, maybe in the afternoon I'll have a lull. So I'll go for a walk. And I used to feel guilty about it. I used to feel like I'm not working hard enough. I'm not doing enough. Now I feel like, look, it's actually in everyone's best interest. And one of my board members said this, like as a business owner, the most important kind of resource you have is your own energy. So if you don't have the energy to put into this, nothing else really matters. So anything you're doing to actually increase and improve your energy is actually the most unselfish thing you can do, both for you and your business. And so I think I've finally come to terms with that, and I've been forced to like thinking about that. So I think that's maybe the other thing in addition to calendaring, which I'm like now more and more aware of that perhaps I wasn't as aware of before. And that's kind of helped with, I guess it bleeds over into all parts of life, but that's kind of one thing. So, sleep. Again, I would be at this mindset of like, I could sleep 5 hours a night and still grind, and I'm going to make it do it. I find now that actually what's I need. I'm not that type of person that can get by on less than 8 hours of sleep. I need that, so I'm going to try very hard to get that. And that's kind of the energy management has been a huge part of, and it has really made me, I think, a happier, healthier person. So that's one thing I truly could like advise for people at any life stage. Just keep track of that, husband and energy, kind of manage it, and then manifest itself in like all such positive ways.
I think that's so good. I have so much that I'd love to. You and I will grab a beer at some point. We can talk a lot more about that. That's such valuable advice. So, Samir Shergood, CEO, co-founder of highbeam.co. It's an e-com bank. They're a tech platform. Thank you so much for joining Return on Podcast today.
Thanks, Tyler. It's been a pleasure.
All right, guys. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Return on Podcast. Every week we're on a quest to deliver value to help you improve your rhythms, to hopefully maybe help you pick up some nuggets about managing your own cash flow better. I know you'll check out highbeam.co. And until we see you next week, take care.